Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Flourish FM. In this episode, Nick and I interview Dr. Miroslav Volf. Miroslav Volf is a prominent theologian, scholar, author, and founding director of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. He was born in Croatia, and Volf experienced the religious and political tensions of his homeland firsthand, which deeply influenced his academic and theological pursuits. Throughout his career, Volf has authored numerous influential books, the most recent of which is Life Worth Living, A Guide to What Matters Most, co-authored with Matthew Croasmun and Ryan McAnnally-Linz, published in March 2023. And that's based on a course he co-teaches at Yale of the same name. And we discussed that book and the course in this episode and how that's informed his views on human flourishing. Nick, what did you enjoy most about our conversation?
I think it was a very fresh perspective on how to even think about the sort of questions that we're asking with this show, right? And early on in the conversation, when he listed some of the ways they'll prompt students in their course, or that he might prompt readers of the book, right? How should a good life feel? How should a good life go or unfold? How should a good life be led? But I didn't, throughout our conversation, and this is what I thought was refreshing, he didn't give us answers necessarily, right? He talked about how it was very cultural, informed by tradition, often highly personalized. But that's okay, because I think the real deep value for me was better understanding the process by which he seeks to understand flourishing and the process by which he tries to help young people do the same. And I thought that was really interesting to hear about. I'm excited for our listeners to hear about it as well.
Me too. Thank you. All right. So this is our episode, everyone, with Dr. Miroslav Volf. All right. Welcome, Miroslav. How are you today?
I'm doing really well.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It's an honor to have you with us on Flourish FM. And Nick and I have really enjoyed reading your most recent book, Life Worth Living, A Guide to What Matters Most. And we'd love to kick things off by talking about that, but in particular, that's based on a course that you and your colleagues teach at Yale of the same name, which you've been teaching now for a decade, right? Since 2014. So could you please tell us about that course and how it led to the writing of this book?
Yes, it's a course mainly for undergraduate students. And I think it comes out of two experiences. One is, I don't know whether you can call it experience, but for me, it was reading a book. And the book that I read was titled Education's End, on why American colleges and universities have given up on the meaning of life. Maybe you recognize the title. It was written by my colleague from here at the law school, Anthony Croasmun. And he kind of traces the development of American higher education, where the reflection on the meaning of life or on purposes, therefore also the great conversation across times about most important questions of our lives gets to be marginalized. And I don't need to go into all the reasons unless you want me to, why that is happening. But then I realized, wow, that which motivated me to study theology, that which is kind of a motivating desire of the entirety of my academic life, but also personal life, namely answering this question of kind of question of why, question of purpose, that is now migrated out of the higher education. And that seemed to me tragic, because earlier it has been at the middle of it. Parallel with that was what really was experience of students who are highly competent, wonderful human beings, but who have never given a thought before they came to Yale, and indeed at Yale, to that question, and who struggle with self-worth, struggle with how to understand their own lives in conjunction with what they feel that they are called to, that they have to do. So kind of these two experiences led to the course, and then course led to the book.
Wow. I'd love to dig into this theme, actually, education, the meaning of life. I'm sure Nick would as well. We both
100%,
have backgrounds as educators. So, I mean, did this course begin then as a kind of a reflection on what needs to be improved in education to promote human flourishing? Were you trying to promote human flourishing through this course, as well as educate students about flourishing?
Yes, that was meant as an intervention, especially into how humanities are being taught. Obviously, there are no grand ambitions here that this intervention would be result necessarily in some major transformation of universities. Although, if I were to dream, that's where I would partly go with it. But it was a sense that even in humanities, the university as a whole, instrumental rationality came to dominate the interest and the business of universities. And associated with that was also dominance of hard sciences.
Sure.
And it seemed to me that humanities have in different ways tried to come as close as they could to the rationality of hard sciences. And that resulted in predominance of the almost purely historical interest in the humanities themselves, and therefore thematization of the great questions and conversations around great questions. It happened as a result of that interest, but not explicitly, predominantly not explicitly as a goal of study itself and of teaching itself. And that to me seemed like a worrisome thing because, I honor historical interest. I learn from historical interest, but kind of a normative vision is at the heart of my interest and certainly should be an important concern of all education.
There's about a dozen different questions I want to ask based on what you laid out there, but we can probably go a bunch of different ways. That last piece there, I think I heard, the big questions that we might ask and sort of this normative vision. I'm curious at some point to understand if you're sort of intertwined with the Good Life Project and Laurie Santos at all a little bit. I wonder how these courses complement each other or maybe don't in some ways, which would be interesting to explore as well. But maybe let's keep it 10, 30,000 feet here. Can you tell us a little bit like kind of what's the course syllabus look like, right? And sort of the book table of contents look like? What are the things, the core questions or the sort of things we should be focusing on or you ask your undergrads to focus on?
So one of the things that maybe differentiates our course from some others, and similar attempts are going on in different universities and have been going for a while. Primarily, though, they are based in a single tradition and try to answer this question from a single tradition. What we have decided, given that we are at the what is self-defined as a pluralistic university, sometimes a secular, but I think it's better understood as pluralistic university, we've decided to have a conversations about what matters most among great traditions, religious traditions and philosophical traditions. And then the challenging part was, how does that not end up being simply a conversation about ideas? How does that go a little bit deeper, and how do students become existentially engaged? So rather than having these either introduction into religions and philosophies for dummies, or remedial kind of course, in that it had to become a course about the bite, so to speak, that these traditions have for our own individual lives. And so basically what we encourage students, what we seek to practice is simply engage those traditions as traditions that makes claim to be true, and ask the students to imagine how their life would change if this tradition were actually true.
That's interesting.
And you can kind of wrestle with the truth of it, but you ought to wrestle with the truth of it. It's not about information, and the truth of it as it has existential implications. Now, then it became a challenge. How do you design the course? which involves multiple traditions, and you have 12 weeks to do that. That has kind of significance for students of the existential kind. And basically, we then decided to ask of each tradition a kind of set of questions, realizing that some of these questions might be more pertinent to one tradition than the other, but nonetheless, that they are kind of the frame or the way of accessing the question that we are after. And so it basically, for us, it meant first, what is the vision of a life that is truly worth living in a tradition? And that would entail for us, what does it mean for life to go well, which is a kind of circumstantial dimension of life. What does it mean for life to be led well, which addresses agency in life? And what does it mean for life to feel right, which is emotions, and in some ways it's in a medium mood. It's both passive and active at the same time. And then we might ask the question, well, so great. You maybe even like a vision, but what reasons does this tradition offer you to think that this is the right way? What motivations does it give you? Or we asked the question, what happens according to these traditions when you fail? And the key question also for us is, to whom are you responsible? So if you take this set of questions and apply it, or some variation of those questions applied to a tradition, we feel the students then get existentially involved, and then student groups are not all students are not from the same tradition. So there's a pluralism there, so that you have it perceived and pursued from different vantage points. And if you guide students to be attentive to the existential dimension, you have great conversations. It has become difficult, of course, and it required training of various teachers that we employ to learn how to lead such an existentially oriented but truth-seeking conversations about fundamental issues.
It sounds like taking something that could be experienced quite abstractly and making it, and it sounds very pragmatic to me in many ways. Not that you're moving the spiritual component, the existential component, right, the challenge there, but you're concretizing it in a way that nudges. I'm thinking of Lisa Miller. Do you and Lisa know each other?
Yeah.
We talked about this a little bit with her, but how do you take something like that and turn it into action so that young people can grapple with it? And it seems to me that that's what you're doing, but correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I think that's to us, that's very important. But another component, for instance, of the class is that we have always a lecture in each of the tradition by a practitioner of that tradition, where they are asked to, and hopefully not kind of professional, either professor of that tradition or if it's a religious tradition, a priest, an imam, or some official representative of religious tradition, but rather just ordinary person, which is what most of our students are going to be. And we also often take, at least in courses that I've taught, there's slight variety sometimes in courses, and it evolves. We've taken always interest in signature practice of a tradition. So for Judaism, of course, this would be a Shabbat, and for Muslim, it would be regular prayer. For Christian, might be it might be forgiveness or something like that, connected with the Eucharist. And so you can meditation for Buddhism, and so you can have these signature traditions, this practices through which you can look at how the tradition actually functions as it is embraced by the practitioner.
Mm-hmm. So this sounds like an amazing course. I mean,
it does.
Over the last 10 years, how have students responded to it, both in terms of not just in terms of how popular it is, but how have they reacted to it in terms of like, this is not the kind of course I was expecting to take at university, let's say, or, these kinds of questions don't typically come up for me in other subjects. Insofar as, to go back full circle to the book Education's End you mentioned by Anthony Croasmun, have they felt that they're learning, say, about the meaning of life and its role in education through this kind of course?
So I'll give you the story. I often tell it because to me it became almost the justification of the course, of the whole idea. After we finished teaching, at that time it was myself and a doctoral student of mine who I asked to help me design the course. After we finished teaching it, and we basically told students, listen, we want to teach it again, but we're not quite sure. We're not quite sure how it came across. How would you change it? So forth. Just help us redesign the course, or tell us how we did. And I'll never remember a 17-year-old, I think 17 or 18-year-old, third-year student, precocious from India, said, before coming to this class, I was never given permission to take with intellectual seriousness questions of kind of existential meaning and purpose. These were kind of marginal things that kind of they're intellectually light, undeserving. Maybe even she participated in the kind of notion that what each of us has our own authentic self. Nobody can tell you what really your purpose of life is. You just look deep down, you follow your dream, or whatever version of approach to leading one's life was around. But she was completely taken by that. And I think a lot of students realize that there are these long, intellectually demanding traditions of very carefully thinking about the nature of life and the meaning of human existence, of what it means to do it really well. And eyes are opened, and it's really fascinating to observe.
So can we you just opened us up there. Can we get into the what does it mean to do it really well piece? And I think your categories earlier, I thought were really interesting sort of questions. I want to repeat them, make sure I got them right. It was essentially, how should a good life unfold, right? There's what should a good life feel like, and how should a good life be led? You said that suggested the agency piece, right? Do we have those three correct?
Yeah, no, exactly. I just want to make sure that sometimes when we say, how does the life go, that by this we mean kind of set of circumstances that one needs to thrive, to live well. It's like a plant. You have to have a certain kind of a soil, and there is such a thing also for human beings, much more complex kind of a soil. But it's there, and then we may also try to figure out, well, different tradition lay different emphases on these various quote unquote components that mutually interpenetrate one another. So that's just a slight footnote to what you've said.
Okay, great. So
awesome.
We've got kind of a synthesis, right, of a lot of these traditions. Obviously we can't reveal the whole kind of recipe in one conversation, but can you share with us some of, the highlights or the core components that maybe that the young people most readily gravitate to as well?
That's an interesting question. What young people gravitate to? I think most natural for them is, well, it's very hard for me. I mean, to say, because it's a very diverse group of students. And so you would have people who would naturally gravitate to kind of the emotional side of things. Life is pretty much prescribed. What we can do, limited circumstances we cannot change very much. And when it comes to agency, most of our lives end up being occupied by things that we cannot control, because we live in the world in which you have to you participate in means creation, and the entirety of your working life is really being deeply immersed in means, and these you have to do as they are done, and therefore what's left, where the true where you have agency, where the meaning can, in a sense, come, is emotional side of things, and that's very interesting then for students, because once you start to go into kind of the emotional side, and for instance, for them to think about a different ways in which one can think about pleasure. In the book, we do something a little bit about that as well. It can be this screaming kind of orgasmic experience. At the same time, it can also be something very, very quiet, a kind of quiet contentment. Tonalities and emotions associated with each of those are very different, and you can then build your entire life in such a way to privilege one or the other, and you might have very good reasons why you might want to do one or the other. That's, in a sense, where the discussion end up going.
Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you, Miroslav. Right. So moving then from the course to the book of the same name, Life Worth Living. Now, that book is about what you and your co-authors describe as the question concerning human flourishing. And it's not as such just a single question we can define in one way. You describe it can be expressed in many ways, some of which you've said so far. So, for example, what matters most? What is a good life? What is the shape of a flourishing life? What kind of life is worthy of our humanity? What is true life? What is right and true and good, and so on. But you write in the book that none of these phrasings captures it completely. So how should we understand what you call the question? And how did you come upon this as a way of understanding human flourishing and making the center of the book?
It's a great question, because
which one?
People over I mean,
the question of this question.
The question about very good. The question about the quest and why the quest can be expressed in multiplicity of different ways. And depending which way you approach this central issue, you'd get slightly different results. Some of it will end up privileging either agency or circumstances or emotional side of things. And we want to make sure that even when some approaches don't have one or the other component, that they often feel obliged to explain why these other components are not involved, or why one or the other is privileged. But to your specific question, it seems that let's see what kind of life is worthy of our humanity. Is a kind of question that people have asked them for a century. I'm not sure that I can go far enough in history to tell you from the very beginning. Whenever we start talking about humans and human evolution, this question was there. But far as we can reach in history, this has been an important question. And there we want to push against the idea of what somebody, I was just reading before starting to talk to you, Georg Simmel's books, German philosopher, sociologist at the turn of the previous set of centuries, who was writing in 1904 or something like that. He wrote the book on Nietzsche and on Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, and he says, well, because we live in this society where means proliferate, and you don't have desire, means, ends in a very short succession after one another, so that at the end of your action is always before your views. Once the means start proliferating, question of meaning of the entire life surfaces before us. I'm not sure that I'm persuaded about this. I would say this is the question that humans ask. This is the question that humans ask, independent whether they're wealthy or whether they are poor independently, or whether they're educated or not, it is at the heart of human existence to ask that question, and we sometimes suppress it when we don't know the answer. Now, I think that question, and I've developed it on the basis of one. My preferred way of talking about it. That question seems to me to be a fundamental one for us as humans, and indeed that much of our lives is, I wouldn't say determined, but shaped by what kind of answer we give to that question, or put slightly differently from other perspective, in the way we actually live, we give one or the other answer to that question. What kind of human is it worth being? What's, as we put it in one of our chapters, what is worth wanting? What's worth truly wanting?
You also write in the book that a comprehensive response to the question would be an entire vision of a good life. So the next big question in response to the question then is, what would such a vision need to involve? What would be some of its components to be a satisfactory response to the question?
So it would have to have answers to some of the set of questions that we give, but these that we explore. But these also would have to be set within a certain kind of world picture or account of reality. Account of who human beings are, and then pretty soon you have the entirety of a philosophy, the entirety of the religious system might be implicated or would be implicated in answering that question. And the reason why we need to think about nature of humanity as well as the nature of the world in which humans are situated is because we cannot live well against the grain of reality. Though there are also such accounts of, or attempts of accounts of the good life, our conviction is that that won't really succeed. So, in a sense, we have in the book chosen relatively limited set of explorations, though we indicate that the larger frame of the question, and also for us, what's important is, especially in the situation in which we find ourselves, is to think in terms of good recipe, of components of the good life. There has to be some kind of a goodness of fit. You generally people we live in fairly individualistic in a sense of. People make their decisions for themselves, certainly about the great questions of life. What Peter Berger used to call heretical imperative is something that is our reality today. We all make our own religious, quote unquote, tradition ourselves in certain ways. Although, of course, we embrace a lot of things that have been prepackaged for us, but we do that, and because of that. We are in temptation, especially in this situation as we live today, where information is accessible, to live or to approach those questions as if we were in a salad bar, and then we can, or choosing flavors of an ice cream, and we can combine whichever we seem to like, and hence we try to indicate there are certain choices you can make, and you can live in a kind of ad hoc way, but at the same time, you have to worry about which pieces fit with one another rather than working at cross purposes. Now you have metaphysics, you have developed anthropology, you have kind of kind of moral philosophy. There you have practical means to reach ends that you are aspiring. Pretty soon you've immersed yourself in an entire vision of life just to answer a simple question: what's really worth wanting? I need to get from point A to point B. Is that point B worth getting to?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, friends. Nick here with just a brief interlude to share with you an update on one of our newest partnerships with the Anti-Fragile Academy. Throughout John and I's conversations with many, if not most, of our guests, one thing has been made really clear. In order for people to flourish, thrive, experience the good life, they need to develop the capacity to not only navigate and endure, but ideally grow from the bad, grow from unpleasant experiences. That's why we're thrilled to be partnering with our newest sponsor, the Anti-Fragile Academy, an organization that I co-founded with Dr. Adam Wright, Director of Mental Performance for the Washington Nationals. At the Anti-Fragile Academy, we work with adolescent athletes, executives, and educators to help them understand some of the science, not just of optimal performance, but of well-being and anti-fragility. The ability not only to endure and bounce back from unpleasantness, but to actually come back stronger, to grow from it. Between Adam and I, we've worked with Fortune 100 companies, Inc. 300 executives, Division I programs, and elite professional athletes and Olympians from all over the world. To find out more about how you can leverage anti-fragility training, check out our website at theantifragileacademy.com. You mentioned earlier, and maybe we can tease this apart into two pieces here, but you mentioned earlier maybe some conceptions of a good life that I can't recall your exact phrasing, but won't get the job done. You know, you're a little skeptical about, right? Yeah. Will you speak to those a little bit, and then maybe we can talk about ingredients. So maybe we juxtapose. Well, what's probably not going to get you there in terms of quality of life and answers to the question or some of these questions, but what's pretty predictive at the same time?
Well, it seems to me that if you organize your life around the calculus of, say, pleasure and pain, which hedonism, is certain kind of, that's right, hedonism, you will find yourself consistently, predictably disappointed because organizing your life around this kind of a dyad is self-defeating and results in a relatively kind of shallow way of living. And plus, it's just doesn't seem so unreasonable to me that if you simply considered your life in those terms, that you might decide that the life is actually not worth living, because depending from which angle you look at it, it may easily be that the amount of pain overwhelms the amount of pleasure. So if you put them on the scale, and then maybe that's like David Benantar. Maybe that's the decision you make about like Schopenhauer in an even more radical way. But on the other hand, one can then think, oh, how smart that it is to weigh pleasures and pain. How smart it is to take them out of the entire frame of the meaning of life. How smart it is to give so much weight to this and forget about kind of sense of agency that you might have, or the good that you might do. How smart is it to live as if satisfaction of your desire is the sole purpose, so then that nothing is truly desirable, but that it is in itself, but it is desirable because you desire it. And so you go down the line, and I think pretty much you can deconstruct it as least plausible way to have a good life. And yet, as it turns out, a lot of people, majority maybe of people, organize their lives precisely in those ways.
And maybe there's a pathway into that then a little bit, because so first of all, and maybe you're already familiar, but the psychological research I'm familiar with backs that up to a T. Right. Yeah. It's just that the kind of pleasure-based, pain-based forms of happiness or well-being, if you will, they're just not very predictive of kind of overall holistic life satisfaction and fulfillment. Right.
Yeah.
And so that suggests something else is. My dissertation was on eudaimonia, right? So I'm coming at this from an angle of meaning. We've had, as John laid out in some of the questions we sent you beforehand, we've had countless conversations, I think, about doing hard things and psychological richness. And we just before we started the interview, we were talking about Paul Bloom and chosen suffering. And so if we move away from this conception that generally is not going to work out for us, and start to say, okay, what are some of the ingredients? Maybe that first one, it sounds like, is the willingness to endure things that have meaning. Maybe it's, I thought I heard a sense of transcendence, which often might be associated with that meaning. But I'm just kind of guessing here, right? What are some of the key ingredients, if not that hedonistic pleasure-pain balance?
We can speak in how various traditions might want to approach this, or we can talk about how I might answer that question, given the perspective from which I come, which is that of the Christian tradition, Christian faith.
So that was going to be my next question: is how this might vary tradition to tradition? Because when we were talking about the course, my takeaway was, well, I don't know if you're familiar with the values and action inventory. It's essentially a character strength. They're like a virtues diagnostic. It comes out of Paz Psych. But the reason this came together, or the methodology, was essentially gathering 55, 60 different researchers from around the world, studying traditions, studying different forms of government, right? Studying civilizations, and kind of saying, all right, what do most people seem to agree on? Like, is virtuous and good to have, and how do we turn that into a taxonomy? And when I first heard exploring it from different traditions, I thought, well, maybe there's a synthesis here that comes away with like the set of ingredients, right? But what I'm hearing from your response is that's not really the case. It's largely cultural and based in background, among other things.
Yeah, that's a really significant question to be discussed in its own right. Are our values, kind of most fundamental values, or actually maybe better to speak about the tables of values? That is to say, those criteria which we use in order to judge everything or discern what might be valuable and what might not be valuable. Whether these criteria of value are easily or even at all kind of tradition independent and discernible as a kind of pan-human way. And my tendency is to say, no, there is no clear way from observation to conclusions about this. Actually, what those kinds of tables of values are very much tradition dependent.
Interesting.
And if that's the case, so say a debate between somebody, say between Nietzsche, who might say that increase in power is the fundamental value, so that the entirety of the set of values is being assessed against the backdrop of that value. Or somebody who says that, let's say Schopenhauer, that actually negation of the will is, and the negation of life itself is what is kind of most fundamental, opening oneself therefore up to something like the nothingness that kind of has some resonance with Indian traditions. And this is the proper way to live your life. So the ascetic movement to divest oneself of power investments in life. Now, how to decide between the two, I wouldn't know. And if you ask what gives the most satisfying life, that again, satisfying would partly depend on what one takes to be valuable in that way. So this is partly also reason why we approach it from multiple tradition rather from simply one, or simply or as Laurie, you mentioned Laurie Santos, and we have very good relations with Laurie. That she's a friend, and I think actually that our two courses are complementary rather than in any way contradictory. That they can be construed as being contradictory, but they are, to me, they're complementary, and that's partly just to continue on the train of thought, because I think at the level of realization of values, it seems to me that we can get to kind of agreement. What needs to happen? What if this is your value? Kind of in Kantian terms, hypothetical questions. If this is your value, I mean, this is what you've got to do in order to get there. And we can test that. We can do experiments. We can whatever, and which is, I think, very, very significant. And some of it will be because. If you look at people, we do share lots of important aspects of the good life, and there it can be very useful and helpful.
I totally agree. That makes a lot of sense. I'm jealous I can't take both courses. I'm curious if you and Laurie have done any sort of cross section. Like, do you know how many students take both courses? Because they do seem very complementary.
Yeah, hers is hers is much more popular. It certainly at the beginning was much more popular than ours, and I mean, without there should be, in what I'm going to say, be no sense of kind of devaluing. To the contrary of what she's doing, but I think fundamentally that she's asking a coping question. A Yale student has to get from point A to point B. A to point B is they have to finish a paper, they have to finish a course, they have to finish the course of study. For that, they need a set of skills, a set of capacities, and they need to know what to do when things don't quite go as well as they're planning to do, because they're in high pressure performance pressure situation. And so the course then is providing skills. How does one do that? I mean, in a similar way, I think it's like the Design Your Life course and also the book. Then not from psychologically informed thinking, but from designed form of thinking, one seeks to figure out how one's own life should go in a certain direction. But neither Laurie nor Evans, I think one of the authors is Evans. They asked the question, well, what's the B that's really worth getting? How does one discern what is significant? There are lots of in-between Bs, of course, that are involved in advice that's being given, but larger purposes of life, and they will then depend on those tables of values and where the direction of the entirety of our lives ought to be going. So I feel that. From my perspective, I don't know whether Laurie was necessarily put it this way. From my perspective, these two are complementary. Just like I think that study of history and influences upon documents of great religious traditions is, for me, a really important endeavor. I think that it is to be put in the service of what these texts are after. That is to say, the form of our living, rather than making this the scientific endeavor, scholarly endeavor, which is kind of the end point. And then people can do whatever they might they want to do with it. I want to say, well, once you get to some result, let's wrestle with what they have to say to each other and to us.
Thank you, Miroslav. So there's so many threads to pull on further here. Nick asked about some of the components that might constitute a good life. And one of the ones you mentioned in your book is, you write that a good life must include a sizable dose of its pain. And as Nick mentioned, this has been a recurrent theme in our episodes, right? So can you please tell us your argument in the book, or from teaching the course, or both, why a sizable dose of pain is necessary for living a good life.
We live in a world in which pain is inevitable, in which causing pain to others seems inevitable. We can modulate the level of pain that is being caused, but we cannot avoid the pain that's being caused. That has to do with the very character of us as limited beings, slightly curved in ourselves, or maybe more than just slightly curved in ourselves, and therefore conflictual nature of our relationship. It has to do with the systems in which we live, which seem to thrive on accentuating the conflicts, competitive nature of societies, fragility, precarity of our lives, that it's going to be there. So the question then becomes not how do you eliminate pain, not even in some ways how do you minimize it, although I think that is also a significant question, because we can minimize it. But the question is, how do you live with pain? What do you do with pain? How can suffering function in your life in such a way as to create out of you something more valuable? My good friend here at Yale is Chris Wyman. I don't know if you are familiar with his work. He's a poet and has written quite a bit about suffering, because he himself has suffered from illness. And he and I are in conversation especially about suffering. He's written a recent book. Take a look at it. Maybe you want to have it on your podcast. Zero to the Bone. 50 entries against despair is the title of the book, which is very fascinating. He's a absolutely marvelous stylist. Those are all essays, beautifully written. And then he has this image of life, of a tree that is growing on the precipice, and it's exposed to winds. And the beauty of this tree is how it has grown as the winds have been battered it, so that life gains can, let's put it this way, life can gain in beauty through suffering. Now that seems quite an unusual position to take, and I'm not entirely sure that I want to prescribe, find yourself a precipice, plant yourself there, and hope and pray for really strong winds in your life. That might not be necessarily a recipe for the good life, but that it might be possible, actually, and that we may need skills to deal and wrestle with suffering and integrate it into a larger set of frame of meaning. That seems to me really fundamental to life.
You familiar with the term anti-fragility? Nassim Nicholas Taleb's book and work?
I've seen. Actually, the first time I was looking at one of your at your website.
At us, yeah. Well, it's because we use a quote from him. It's be the flame, wish for the wind.
Oh wow, that's
striking
that's
parallel that you brought that up.
Yes,
yeah, but that's what my head went to is and I used. Back when I was in education, I was at a conference that was keynoted by actually a guest we had on the show, Jeff Duncan Andrade, and he shared the story of a Tupac Shakur poem, "The Rose That Grew from Concrete." And it's the same sort of idea, just like the beauty that can come from these otherwise really like terrible conditions. But that's not, so like it really resonates. But I also hear you. That's not the same thing as saying, hey, go find yourself some concrete and try to grow in it and good luck, right? Those are slightly different things. But if suffering is inevitable, the argument I would make is we should use whatever agency we do have to try to prepare ourselves for it. John's written about robustness as an example of resilience, right? Those sorts of things.
Yeah. I've got to read some of the stuff that you've done. I very much resonate myself with this. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we're growing in references. I'm adding to our show notes for today. I've got a lot of tabs open right now. So listeners, all these names mentioned, such as Anthony Croman, David Benatar, and so on, we will add these to show notes, and episodes with Lisa Miller, for example. Okay, so another thread we could pull on here is in the book, you raise problems with the modern slogan, long, happy, and healthy, as a way of summing up a life worth living, which is what, if you ask many people, what does it mean to live a good life? That might be a common response. I'd love to live a long, happy, and healthy life. Seems great, right? And this perhaps connects with what you just said there about a good life having to include a sizable dose of pain. So you give counterexamples to this, such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Abraham Lincoln, as people who sum up what it means to live a life worth living, but perhaps didn't live lives that are long, happy, and healthy. So what's wrong with thinking of a long, happy, and healthy life as a vision of a life worth living? What's problematic about that as flourishing?
So I don't think it's anything problematic in longevity, nothing problematic in happiness, nothing problematic in health. We haven't added there, but so if you ask our students, and that's one of the assignments that we give to our students, one of the first assignments is to kind of analyze Yale's implicit vision of the good life. We're trying to teach them how to do kind of analytic work of institutions and whole cultural modes, what is embedded in the imagination in terms of the character of...
I bet that's fascinating.
It's but it's kind of boring in a sense at the end. For them, it's fascinating. For us, it's also fascinating, the process. But what's boring is that basically almost without fail, success ends up being the great, and then that success, by however out there success is being defined, whatever is kind of a general consensus around success that counts as a success, that is a success. So. And I think there's nothing wrong in any of these, but the question is whether this actually gives a weight to our lives and imbues them with meaning, or do we simply skirt on the surfaces if we make these features of maybe a good life to be what we are striving after. That's the purpose of the examples that we give short life, because something was more important to Martin Luther King than life itself. He did knowingly what he did, that it may cost him his life. And so the purpose of those three popular definitions of life is to problematize them so that people can step back and ask, would I do as Martin Luther King? And even if I wouldn't, would I think that it's really admirable to do that? Or should I just give myself to the inner turmoil in my soul that I might have? Or might there be a way for me to move in the direction, not to become Abraham Lincoln, but to make the steps in which something much more productive than release from ailments can be the goal of my life.
It's such important work. I mean, before you could even answer that question, just having spent, again, we're educators by trade, and so I spent a decade plus at let's just say an institution that was focused on getting its kids into Yale and Harvard and these other schools for those exact reasons, like the identical sort of population. And I just knew where you were going with it. And I just love the fact that, it doesn't sound like there's any judgment that that's what they think the implicit vision is, but the course is designed to just push them to explore other possibilities and options and ask questions. And it sounds like it in a really healthy, thoughtful way.
Well, that's in a sense a backdrop for us to ask the question, okay, great, but is that all to life? Don't you want more to it? Who defines it? And once you start to unwrap that idea and kind of look at it more carefully, you realize kind of certain kind of vacuity of that free floating notion of success.
Mm-hmm. It's good.
And not just vacuity, in a sense, but also danger, because it's tied to competitive relationships, and it's tied to the self value of the self as a successful, in contrast to others, to having been first in the high school. So when you could come to Yale. But then when you're at Yale, you are one of 5,000, and suddenly your life is made insecure. You have no idea who actually you are. If you make it the basis of your life, you're lost in many ways, and you'll be always. Every gain is a loss in some ways.
100%. Yeah. I mean, it's the hedonic treadmill, chasing your own tail, those sorts of things. But we see it. I work with a lot of athletes. You'll see that in, I think, any performance arena, right? When that identity becomes intimately tied to the performance metric, whatever it is, it's typically problems that ensue.
That got me into to writing a book. I just finished it and sent it off. The title of the book is
Congratulations.
The Flame of Ambition, on why striving to be better than others makes us worse.
Love it.
I basically approach it through looking John Milton and Søren Kierkegaard and Apostle Paul. But there's variety, and Rousseau at the very beginning. There are varieties of ways in one could approach that. It's really a malady of the society that's not generally recognized as a problem, but to the contrary, that's praised as something that enhances life.
It's great. Miroslav, we want to be respectful of your time. We know you're very busy, whether you're choosing to be or not, you are. So we want to make sure and get you out of here on time. We've got one question that we admit up front sort of fails to acknowledge nuance and complexity and those sorts of things, and it tries to get at simplicity. And the question is what we call the flourishing question. Young people, adults, parents, whoever it might be, listening to the show right now, if you had a piece of advice to just help them get started on maybe finding some of their personalized, culturally specific answers to the question, if you will, what's a good starting point?
I think for me, the starting point would be orient yourself, at least for a while, for a little period in time, either to serving somebody else rather than you, and so I'm going to.
Okay. All right, great. Yeah, we'll take it.
And celebrating what is, rather than striving for what isn't yet. 6 days you should work, and one day you should celebrate the goodness of what is. And I'd want to encourage all of us to take 6 minutes of striving and 1 minute of celebrating the good that is there.
Love that.
Love that. Yeah.
Good psychological backing too. I heard giving and gratitude. It's great. It's perfect.
Absolutely.
It's perfect. So
thank you so much, Miroslav.
Yeah, this has been an absolute pleasure. Where can people engage with you, find out more about your various books, your articles, courses, content, those sorts of things?
Yeah, the best place to go is the website of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, yale.edu/faith. And there, you can find just about everything we do.
Great. Yeah, we'll drop that in the show notes as well, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for listening to Flourish FM. We hope you enjoyed the content. Please be sure to leave us a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to your podcast and on all major social media platforms.
And if you visit our website, flourishfmpodcast.com, you can sign up to our newsletter. We send out a weekly newsletter. First newsletter of every month, we share a long-form blog, and every newsletter, every week, we share highlights from our previous episodes. Please hit subscribe on our website.